Before paprika became a kitchen staple, before it colored stews, seasoned sausages, or sat in bright red jars in grocery stores, it was once a guarded secret in medieval Iberia. Not because it was expensive, not because it was rare, but because ordinary families believed this humble red powder could help them survive the winter. Imagine a world where a few dried pepper pods locked inside a wooden chest meant the difference between a bleak, flavorless season and one that felt warm, rich, and comforting. A world where families passed down seeds like heirlooms, guarded their paprika jars from neighbors, and treated this simple spice with the same care they gave to their livestock and harvest. This is the forgotten story of how paprika, something you probably sprinkle on your food without a second thought, became a quiet treasure of medieval life. And the truth behind it is far stranger, deeper, and more human than you'd ever expect. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back to a time when a handful of red powder held the power to shape meals, traditions, and entire communities. You might not think much of paprika when you see it today in small glass jars lined up neatly in grocery store aisles. But if you drift back through the centuries and place yourself in medieval Iberia, in the years just before and after the turn of the 16th century, you would discover that this gentle red powder was once a source of quiet intrigue, cautious experimentation, and eventually, a form of domestic treasure whose value lay not in gold or silver, but in the steady, comforting flavor it lent to the daily meals of ordinary people. To understand why medieval Iberians guarded their paprika so carefully, you must imagine a world where comfort was rare, where survival depended upon the small things, and where a single new plant could shift the rhythms of homes, villages, and entire regions without ever appearing in royal proclamations or merchant ledgers. Picture first the Iberian Peninsula around 1493, a place of sun-baked plains, terraced hillsides, crumbling stone walls covered in moss, and villages that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. People lived closely with the land because the land dictated everything: when they rose, what they ate, how they worked, and when they rested. Seasons were their calendar, the church their anchor, and the household garden their laboratory. Into this world, without fanfare, without ceremony, came seeds from distant land, seeds carried across the Atlantic in the pockets of sailors, stored in the cargo of returning caravels, and passed quietly from hand to hand until they reached the warm soil of Iberian gardens. Nobody knew then that these seeds would someday produce the mild peppers that would be dried, ground, and transformed into what we now call paprika. Nobody recognized their potential. They were curiosities, foreign plants grown for their novelty as much as their usefulness. The first Iberians to care for them were not nobles or wealthy merchants, but monks, patient keepers of gardens, who cataloged the botanical oddities arriving from the New World. Monasteries acted as calm, contemplative research centers long before the idea existed formally. Their stone walls sheltered not only prayer and study, but also a quiet fascination with plants. One such place, the Monasterio de Juste, kept a garden journal that mentioned pods that reddened the fingers when crushed. The monk who wrote this line did so without any sense of future consequence. He was simply observing, perhaps with mild curiosity, perhaps with indifference. Little did he know that the subtle red pigment inside those pods would one day influence the cooking of entire regions. Long after his own name was forgotten, yet monasteries were not the only spaces that shaped the destiny of these peppers. As seeds spread outward into villages, Iberian households, many of them modest and far removed from the centers of political importance, became the true stewards of the plant. Each family had its own way of tending gardens. Some used clay pots, others small fenced plots behind their homes. Children weeded the gardens as part of their chores. Women harvested herbs for cooking, and older men often managed the more delicate plants. Into this everyday rhythm entered the mild pepper plants with their bright green leaves and vibrant pods. At first, villagers did not know whether to fear or trust the plants. Some pods were fiery and unpleasant, others mild and flavorful. Families would test them cautiously, biting off tiny pieces and reacting with laughter, surprise, or regret. In time, they began to distinguish which varieties burned the tongue and which merely offered a gentle warmth. They learned how long to dry the pods in the sun, how to string them together with twine, and how to grind them with smooth stones into a fine powder. The knowledge developed slowly but spread reliably, passing from one household matriarch to another, from neighbor to neighbor, and from generation to generation. You must remember that medieval cooking was not varied. The majority of meals consisted of stews made from legumes, grains, onions, garlic, and sometimes bits of salted meat. Color was rare. The daily pottage, thick and brown, was practical but lacked vibrancy. So when these new peppers, once dried, produced a deep red powder that could tint broths and enliven otherwise plain dishes, they became especially treasured. In a world of muted tones, a burst of color mattered, and so paprika began its quiet climb toward household importance. It was never a luxury good on the scale of saffron, which was literally worth its weight in gold, but it became a valued companion in the kitchen, one that families came to rely on more than they ever expected. Paprika-flavored food improved its appearance, helped mask the taste of aging ingredients, and offered a sense of warmth during cold Iberian winters when meals often felt inadequate. In this way, paprika was not simply a spice, it was a small survival tool. But before paprika became something to guard, it first became something to cherish. Imagine a modest Castilian family in the early 1500s. Their home is a low mud brick structure with a wooden roof, a single hearth, and a small garden outside. Each summer, they pick pepper pods, lay them on woven mats, and let the dry air pull the moisture from their skins. The pods become wrinkled, light, and crisp. Then, in late afternoon, the mother sits with a grinding stone on her lap, crushing the dried pods into a red powder that stains her fingertips. She hums while she works, thinking about the winter ahead, knowing that this jar of paprika will help her stretch limited ingredients into flavorful meals. This powder, simple as it may seem, is the result of labor, care, and time. And this is one reason why families guarded it. Paprika represented a small measure of security, a guarantee of enjoyable meals during the lean months. Unlike imported spices, which could be cut off by war or poor harvests elsewhere, paprika grew in their own soil. It was a spice that empowered ordinary people, allowing them to enrich their food without relying on markets or traders. Another layer of value came from the diversity of the peppers themselves. Some families discovered strains that dried better, produced richer colors, or had a more pleasing flavor. These seeds became heirlooms, guarded quietly within the household. A family might store its best seeds in a small cloth pouch kept inside a wooden chest, away from moisture and pests. They planted these seeds each spring, hoping to preserve the qualities that made their paprika unique. There was also a subtle sense of competition among neighbors. If one household produced paprika with a deeper red color, others might try to obtain seeds from them or secretly observe their gardening methods. This was not a rivalry of hostility, but one of quiet pride. In some villages, a family known for producing excellent paprika gained a small form of local status, nothing grand. Just a gentle acknowledgement that their seasoning made food taste a little better. Over time, paprika even began to mark regional identities. In Aragon, the spice lent warmth to stews cooked by shepherds tending flocks in the foothills of the Pyrenees. In Portugal, fishermen used it to coat salted cod, creating a distinctive reddish hue that became visually iconic. In Extremadura, farmers added paprika to sausages and preserved meats, developing recipes that would survive for centuries. Though medieval people rarely wrote about these things, the spice quietly carved its way into their cultural memory. Still, paprika's rise was not without resistance. Some older villagers distrusted the plant, suspicious of anything foreign. Others believed the red powder might irritate the stomach or warm the blood excessively. Concerns rooted in the medieval understanding of humoral theory. But as younger generations took control of household kitchens, these fears faded. Practical experience won out. Paprika proved itself reliable. It was easy to grow, easy to store, and consistently useful. By the early 16th century, paprika had become common in many parts of the Iberian Peninsula, though still largely overlooked by the nobility. Its importance lived within the domestic sphere, among gardens, kitchens, and family traditions. But what truly transformed paprika into something guarded was not rarity or cost. It was the fragility of food security. Medieval Iberian life was precarious. A single drought could ruin crops. A late frost could devastate fruit trees. Disease could wipe out livestock. In such an unpredictable world, any dependable food resource became precious. Paprika, with its long shelf life and ability to enhance bland meals, became woven into a broader strategy of survival. Families dried peppers in large batches, stored them in clay vessels sealed with cloth, and placed them carefully on high shelves, away from moisture and rodents. The spice became a kind of household reserve like dried beans, salted fish, or hard cheeses. Some accounts from rural regions mention families who locked their paprika stores inside wooden boxes, not because the spice was inherently valuable in trade, but because it was deeply valuable to them. A winter without paprika meant dull meals, lowered spirits, and a sense of monotony that wore on the family's morale. Pepper mills and grinding stones were passed down as treasured tools, some even carved with symbols or initials. You also must imagine how paprika interacted with preservation methods. Salted meats, especially pork, formed a major part of winter diets. But paprika helped coat these meats, lending color and an additional layer of flavor that balanced the saltiness. In some regions, people noticed that paprika seemed to help the preservation process, keeping the surface of meat drier and more aromatic. Whether or not the spice had any real antibacterial effect was beside the point. The practical result was that the meat lasted longer and tasted better. That alone made paprika worth guarding. But paprika's story is not only about households and kitchens. It is also about the slow movement of ideas across generations. As Iberia transitioned deeper into the early modern period, paprika's uses expanded. Apothecaries took interest in it, claiming it warmed the stomach and improved digestion. Physicians occasionally recommended mild pepper powders for sluggish blood or cold humors. Travelers wrote brief notes about its presence in rural cooking. Yet even with this growing acknowledgement, paprika remained tied to the identity of ordinary people rather than elites. And perhaps that is why it was protected so fiercely. It belonged to the households, not the courts. It was a spice that empowered the poor more than the wealthy. It offered beauty, flavor, and comfort at a time when life rarely offered any of those things without cost. Imagine now an aging grandmother in a quiet village near the Tagus River. She sits near the hearth, wrapped in a wool shawl, watching her daughter prepare the evening meal. The daughter reaches into a small jar of paprika, sprinkling it into a pot of simmering lentils. The grandmother nods approvingly. She remembers years when the paprika stores were low, when harsh weather made food feel bleak. She has taught her family that the paprika must be used wisely, never wasted, never shared carelessly, and always replenished with the best seeds. Outside, the wind carries dust across the village paths. Inside, the house fills with the gentle aroma of paprika warming over the fire, its color glowing softly in the dim room. This scene, replicated countless times across Iberia, reveals the quiet intimacy that developed between families and their spice jars. Paprika was not simply food, it was continuity, memory, tradition. A family's paprika tasted slightly different from that of their neighbors, shaped by seeds, soil, sunlight, and drying methods. And that uniqueness made it something to guard. The crown never taxed paprika. Guilds never controlled its distribution. Merchants never monopolized it in medieval times. Its value was not imposed from above, but cultivated from below. It thrived because ordinary people nurtured it, understood it, and relied upon it. By the time Paprika reached the height of its cultural importance in Iberia, long after the medieval centuries had passed, its roots were already so deeply embedded in the daily life of the peninsula that no one could imagine cooking without it. Later generations would develop smoky varieties, sweet varieties, and hot varieties. Some regions would build entire culinary identities around the spice. But all of that came from these early centuries of humble guardianship. When you look at a simple jar of paprika today, you are glimpsing the distant echo of these households, of monks who observed its color with curiosity, of villagers who dried it in the sun, of mothers who stored it carefully, and of families who guarded their seeds as if they were part of themselves. The story of paprika in medieval Iberia is not dramatic. It lacks wars, kings, and grand events. Instead, it is made of small decisions repeated over generations: planting, drying, grinding, storing, and protecting. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of all, that a spice so quiet, so unassuming, could leave such a lasting imprint on a culture simply by becoming a companion to the meals that sustained people through their hardest years. That is why medieval Iberians guarded their paprika like treasure. Because for them, in a world ruled by uncertainty, small comforts were not small at all. They were life itself. Thank you for staying with me through this quiet journey into the small, forgotten corners of history. If this story helped you unwind, drift, or simply enjoy a slower moment in your day, I'm glad you were here. This is Quiet, Boring Sleep, a place where the world slows down, the noise fades, and even the most ordinary stories find a gentle rhythm to rest beside you. If you'd like more calm, comforting history to fall asleep to, it truly helps when you like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's a small gesture, but it supports this peaceful little space we're building together. Rest well, take a slow breath, and I'll meet you again in the next quiet story.